On the third day he rose again from the dead. For the modern intellect, this line of the Apostles' Creed demands an impossible concession. For centuries, the Church has equated this confession with a very specific biological picture: the sudden restarting of a halted heart and the reactivation of decaying cellular tissue inside a tomb. This forces honest minds into a strict intellectual bind. You either sign off on an absolute medical impossibility, or you retreat to the position of theologians like Rudolf Bultmann, reducing the entire event to a subjective psychological experience that only happened inside the minds of the disciples. Both positions fail because they share the exact same flawed premise. They assume that if a physical resurrection occurred, it had to be a biological resuscitation. They are trying to solve the wrong physical model. By forcing the event into that narrow material framework, the Church loses the resurrection as an intellectually robust historical reality. If we look closely at the primary sources, the biblical authors never actually described Jesus' return from the dead as a medical resuscitation. In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul explicitly writes that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. If the resurrection is merely the reactivation of blood and flesh, Paul's core theological argument collapses. 1 Peter frames this as a strict dimensional dichotomy. The text states that Christ was put to death in the realm of the flesh, the sarx, but made alive in the realm of the spirit, the pneuma. We see this distinction clearly when comparing Jesus to Lazarus. Lazarus was brought back to his former three-dimensional biological state. He walked out of a tomb, resumed his normal life, and eventually died again. Treating the resurrection of Christ as a similar medical revival is scientifically problematic, and it directly contradicts the texts it claims to defend. To explain what actually happened, Paul uses the analogy of a seed in 1 Corinthians 15. When you plant a seed, it dissolves. The original physical structure is destroyed, yet the essential information, the core identity, survives and rises as an entirely different biological form. Paul contrasts our current state, the soma psychikon, one natural body, with the resurrected state, which he names the soma pneumatikon, the spiritual body. This new state is governed by an entirely different set of physical laws. Material thermodynamics and cellular decay no longer apply. The governing principle of this existence is spirit. The text describes a structural upgrade of existence itself. To comprehend it, we have to borrow vocabulary from outside classical biology. This structural upgrade perfectly explains the bizarre physical anomalies recorded in the gospel appearance narratives. Christ suddenly materializes inside rooms with locked doors, walks unrecognized alongside his closest friends, and vanishes in the middle of a meal. A biologically revived 3D corpse cannot perform these actions. We can model this by looking at dimensional projection. If a three-dimensional sphere descends and passes through a two-dimensional plane, the observers on that flat plane won't see a sphere. They will perceive a two-dimensional circle that suddenly appears out of nowhere, grows, shrinks, and vanishes. Jesus did not dematerialize on the road to Emmaus or in the upper room. He moved along a higher dimensional axis that three-dimensional observers simply could not track. The gospel writers were not drafting ghost stories. They were precisely documenting the exact phenomenology of a higher dimensional reality intersecting with a lower one.
Modern physics provides a geometric framework for this intersection, the Minkowski-Einstein 4D space-time model, often referred to as the block universe, where past, present, and future exist simultaneously as a single block of reality. Within a four-dimensional ontology, a resurrected entity is not bound to a single moving point on a timeline. They transition to an existence outside of temporal decay. In physics, when a substance entirely changes its physical properties and laws of interaction while maintaining its core identity, we call it a phase transition. This phase transition model directly answers the skepticism surrounding the empty tomb. When a seed becomes a plant, no shell remains. A complete phase transition leaves no physical residue behind. The tomb was empty because the biological matter was entirely converted, not because a corpse walked away. Physics does not prove the resurrection. It provides the precise vocabulary we need to conceptualize it as a rational, objective event. This higher dimensional framework forces us to read the ascension differently. Viewing it as a vertical rocket launch into the clouds makes little sense on a rotating globe where up changes direction by the hour. When the texts say Christ sat at the right hand of God, they are invoking ancient Near Eastern legal language for the assumption of authority and co-regency. It is a description of power, not a spatial GPS coordinate. We see a shadow of this in the quantum realm. Phenomena like quantum entanglement demonstrate that at the deepest layers of reality, two systems can be correlated independent of the physical distance between them. Spatial separation is not an absolute barrier. The ascension was the moment Christ transitioned from being localized in a single set of 3D coordinates in Galilee to a state of absolute, universal presence across all spatial coordinates simultaneously. The ascension did not initiate Christ's absence from the world. It was the exact mechanism that enabled his omnipresence. Understanding this omnipresence reframes the concept of the second coming, known in Greek as the parousia. In the Hellenistic world, this word did not mean a future arrival from a distant place. It was a technical term for the visible manifestation of a king who was already ruling over a territory. Scholars mapping this realist trans-physical model insist that the resurrection actually happened in history. It remains an objective event, not a subjective metaphor. Under this model, the parousia is not a future physical invasion from deep space. It is the final, complete unveiling of the four-dimensional presence that already permeates our reality. Believers participate in this now through what we might call a daily spiritual parousia. Whenever a person aligns their life and actions with that higher access, they experience localized manifestations of that ruling presence. Eschatology shifts from a timeline of future predictions into an active participation in a hidden present reality. This ontological reverse engineering gives us a radically different definition of human death. Death is no longer a cessation of consciousness or an indefinite wait in a metaphysical holding room. It is the threshold of our own phase transition, an immediate progression along the exact path carved out by the first fruits. In the 1st century, Athenian philosophers mocked the idea of corpses climbing out of graves. 21st century skeptics mock the exact same biological picture. Yet the biblical texts never made that claim. When we strip away the resuscitation fallacy and apply the geometry of higher dimensions, the resurrection ceases to be a stumbling block for the intellect. It stands out as a rational, objective reality, offering the most profound hope in the universe.